Hi everybody. Remember me, Shahryar Panuri. We're going to be talking about development economics. Before I start with the revision lecture, I just hope all of you, wherever you're watching, are doing well. Um, the purpose of this lecture is just to go over some of the concepts that we had discussed over the course of the semester. It's essentially serves as driving, driving or jogging your memory towards various things and sort of various highlights. Of course, it if a concept is not covered in this particular lecture, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be potentially on the exam. But essentially, what this is to help you remember, various aspects of the lectures that we covered in development economics the previous semester. Okay, so with that little caveat, we'll begin. I just want to say, just reiterating before we get into this as well, the online assessment, which replaces your final exam, is going to happen at the same time as your original final exam was scheduled. It is supposed to take about 2 hours of your time, but you have up till 24 hours to do it. And in case you missed it, I've sent a series of emails on Blackboard talking about what different aspects of this assessment. So I'd like you to refer to those. And then, of course, as always, if you have any questions, just send me an email. I will also be holding office hours at my regular times on Tuesdays between 11 and 1. And I'll send an email about how precisely I'm going to do that in this new sort of lockdown environment. Okay, so with that, this just a quick slide to remind you why we're doing this, why we started talking about development economics to begin with. And of course, one of the main drivers or inspirations to me is just the incredible amount of poverty that exists all over the world, what people have to do to fight to stay alive, and how economics can contribute and help. So that's certainly a place where we're going to start. Okay, going all the way back to the first lecture, the introduction. The first thing we talked about early on is how we even sort of identify what's a low-income country, what's a high-income country, what's an upper middle income and a lower middle income country. And so the World Bank, of course, collects data on incomes across the world. And what this is basically then it uses the sort of atlas method to be able to allow for comparisons across countries, and then based on that it makes classifications on whether you're above a certain income threshold in terms of gross national income per capita, then you get classified as a high income country, and if you're below, then you get classified as a low income country. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, is that we need to be able to compare incomes, output, all of these sort of economic indicators across countries. But what's difficult is that currency doesn't exactly translate. Okay, so what that means is that $1 in the US or in the UK is not the same as $1 in Lesotho or in Bangladesh. So we need some way of converting these prices across societies. And the way that we do it is, what I refer to as the Atlas method used by the World Bank, which is basically a 3-year average of exchange rates adjusted for inflation. But essentially what it does is it uses the prices of a standard basket of goods. So this would be like a basket of goods that would be relevant anywhere in the world. You know, a bag of flour, a bag of rice, things like that. Go into that basket, and then they pick prices for those baskets across these different countries and use them to compare. Then the Atlas method comes in on top to try and correct for exchange rates and correct for inflation. Okay, but the idea is that you need to adjust these prices and basically adjust incomes according to what that income will buy you. Okay, so the gross national income using the purchasing power parity method is more appropriate because it essentially is like comparing apples with apples, right? It's not about currency, but it's about what that currency will buy. But then we asked ourselves, okay, so is it true that income equals development, right? And now we're sort of we're thinking about what development even really means. Okay, now the way that we've been talking about it or discussing it for a long time is that it's in terms of income, and the reason why we started talking about it is because that's the first thing that we were able to reliably measure. Okay, but development means much more than money. Yeah, so it can mean things like a higher standard of living, better health and education, happiness. It can mean greater political freedoms, human rights, social liberties, gender equality, and so on and so forth. Okay, economies with low levels of income can actually ensure higher standards of living through better healthcare and education. Cuba is an example of that, but there's others as well. Okay, so development does not necessarily mean just income. Okay, we sort of need to think about it from a broader perspective. And it might not surprise you that scholars have been thinking about this for quite some time. So Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in 1998, he talked about enhancing people's capabilities. Okay, he used this term functionings. Basically, it is that development means increased capability of people to pursue whatever it is that makes them better off. Okay, so essentially you can think of this as expanding choice sets. And of course, what that means is, with such a holistic sort of definition, is that building schools is not enough, doesn't equate to development. What we need is measures that will allow people to make use of these schools. Okay. Examples of these are gender inequality, which is not the same as just raising income levels. And so the idea is to try and capture this idea of development that allows people to live better lives. And of course, this inspired the United Nations Human Development Index that we talked about in the lecture as well, which actually included, in addition to income, it included literacy and basically and health. Right, life expectancy and literacy, which were two indicators of health and education, to try and capture the multidimensional aspect of development a little. There's been other conceptual definitions of development as well, and you can explore more of these. But the broader point is that development we think of as more than just giving people money, right? It's going beyond that. It's about increasing standards of living. It's allowing people to expand their choice sets in various ways. And so you have the definition just right up top is kind of contentious and still divides people, right? What it means to develop. That being said, income typically tends to be our single greatest indicator. When you talk about the economy. You'll hear GDP mentioned over and over. People will talk about growth, and when they talk about growth, they're talking about growth in GDP specifically. And so that the idea of development equaling income refuses to go away. But what you need to know is that this is a multidimensional um, uh, concept, and the definition goes a lot deeper and a lot further than income. Human development, as I mentioned to you, the United Nations had a human development index, and the idea of human development, or at least the way the United Nations was thinking about it, is that it's reducing poverty, improving health and education, and the focus then goes beyond income and into quality of life. Okay, and so the Human Development Index, as I just told you, included these three indicators. So it took income, but it also included longevity and knowledge, health and education, okay? And essentially made it an average. Okay, so now after we talked about defining development, how we define it. We also talked about measuring development. How do we measure it? We kind of started with that concept, and then once you kind of have a fuzzy definition and a fuzzy measurement, you can start to classify countries into developed and developing. Right? So two different kinds of countries. You can sort of split the world into two. And then what you do, and once you do that, is that you can then draw out general lessons about from developing countries and basically ask yourself, well, what would I expect to find if I was going to a developing country, right? If I was visiting a developing country, what are the features of developing countries that perhaps make them developing and not developed? So right up top, the first thing is they tend to have lower per capita income. Second, they have low human development in terms of lower life expectancy, as well as lower levels of literacy. Okay, and they tend to have lower productivity. So for each unit of labor or even each unit of capital, they're producing less. You have lower levels or low levels of human capital, so low levels of education. You tend to have higher levels of inequality and higher levels of absolute poverty. Absolute poverty meaning the number of people living below poverty line. You have higher population and higher levels of population and higher population growth rates. So there's more people and they're also growing at a faster rate. You'll also find things like social fractionalization, so infighting within the country. You will have a larger share of people living in rural areas rather than urban areas. You'll see lower levels of industrialization, so the amount of output as a proportion of GDP that is contributed by the industrial sector tends to be lower. Also lower levels of employment, lower levels of exports. Tend to have poorer resource endowments and geography. So a lot of these countries might be landlocked. They might not have, might be deserts, things like that, have difficulty accessing water. You'll see underdeveloped markets for various reasons. You might have missing institutions or poor infrastructure. You will also see impacts of colonialism, things like extractive institutions. We'll talk about those. But also a higher degree of dependency on the former colonialists. And you'll see a greater share of the public sector in the economy. So the public sector is producing more things. It's running more. Okay. So then we talk about models of economic growth. And here we essentially dip into the history of people trying to explain why is it that countries have grown. Okay. Now, growth again, especially when we're talking about these models, tend to be thought of in terms of income. Income. Here's a summary or the classification of the different theories. I won't go into the theories in depth. Please refer to the previous slides for those. Basically, these are the models that you should know. Right? You should know the Lewis model, you should know the solo growth model for sure, and endogenous growth theory. And then also have a sort of working understanding of institutional theories of comparative development, both the classic and contemporary, and the stages of growth. Okay. So just very quickly, I mean, these are different theories. The institutional approach is basically, it focuses on a broad notion of development. So it's looking beyond just income, but it's looking at institutions. Okay. And by institutions, we typically mean rules of the game. So you can think of institutions as economic institutions, political institutions, how those have developed. A simple way to think about this is property rights. Right? So you think about how property rights have developed and been enforced in developing countries versus developed countries. And that helps to explain how countries have developed. And in fact, it's quite a deep point, because it's such a simple thing as whether or not you're able to protect your property is an important feature in your, the productivity that you have in your day-to-day life, what you can do with assets, how much you can plan for the future, how much resources you have to waste in policing things, basically things of that nature. You also have Rostow's stages of growth, which is again a long-range model, but now has a very, very narrow concept of development in terms of GDP and a higher standard of living. Basically, again, looking at historical evidence, right? And looking at how countries have developed and turning them into a series of stages. And then you have the Lewis model. The Lewis model, as you remember, divides your economy up into two sectors, the agricultural sector and the industrial sector. It makes this tacit assumption that the industrial sector is the engine of growth, and then it demonstrates how people move out of agriculture into industry and how growth occurs. Again, narrow notion of development, looking at mainly in terms of GDP growth. And then you have the growth model. So you have, the solo growth model, but also the Romer endogenous growth theory. And the idea is, again, entirely concerned with growth in GDP, but they have very sharp predictions based on mathematical models that underpin them. And it's important that you have certainly a rudimentary understanding of how these models work. So why do these models exist? They're asking questions like, how do you sustain growth? Where does growth come from? And how does a poor country catch up to a rich country over the long run? Okay. The main two types of growth models that we talked about were the solo model and the endogenous growth models. The main distinction between the solo model and the endogenous growth model is how they view capital. Okay, so the solo model just views capital as one thing, which is just physical capital. The endogenous growth models then make a distinction between physical capital and human capital, and that leads to fairly different predictions. So it's important that you understand what those distinctions are. Then, if you remember, we talked about in the solo growth model how countries basically implement, what you can do is you can use the solo growth model to essentially back out an equation, okay? And the good thing about that equation is that you can fit it to data, right? Because you have data on GDP over time, and labor and capital to determine technological growth. Okay, and so what researchers did was test the solo growth model using this using the data to try and understand whether or not Solo's prediction of convergence is true. Right? So, according to the Solo model, the prediction was clear convergence, that poor countries should grow faster than rich countries because at a certain point in time we all hit the steady state, right? We will develop as much as we can potentially develop. Okay, so in order for that to happen, poor countries must grow faster than rich countries. When you bring this equation to the data, you actually find evidence for what we call conditional convergence, that there is a steady state growth path for rich countries and a steady state growth path for poor countries. Okay, and each of these countries, each of these sort of subsets of countries are indeed converging, but they're converging to different paths. Right? So in that sense, the Solo growth model's prediction didn't actually pan out, and we needed, that provided impetus for endogenous growth theory. We needed something else to explain why real world development was looking very different from development in the theoretical. Okay. Then we talked about impact evaluation, and impact evaluation, so I'm going to open this door here because it's a little warm. Impact evaluation is basically, in contemporary development, it's a way to establish the effectiveness of different development policies. So what you want to do is be able to evaluate whether whatever you're doing in order to aid development is actually helping development or not. And so in the impact evaluation lecture, we discussed all the different types of evaluation techniques that you could implement, starting from experiments all the way down to case studies, that you can implement to try and understand whether or not your policy, whatever it is having a particular impact on people. So what we needed to discuss, just as a start, is what we mean by causality, right? How do we establish it? For that, I take you back to David Hume, who basically talked about three main elements that establish causality: correlation, that two things need to be moving together; temporal order, meaning in order for A to cause B, A has to happen before B; and the third thing, which is the most difficult, is elimination of alternate explanations. Okay, so what you have to do is eliminate all possible alternative explanations except for the one that you are left with, right? So in order for A to cause B, you also have to eliminate C causing B, D causing B, and so on. Okay. Now, some other terminology we talked about is internal validity and external validity, and I'll ask you to refer back to your notes about that. We also talked about different sources of data. So we can have happenstance data, which is just a byproduct of ongoing uncontrolled processes. Examples of these are, GDP or unemployment rates, things like that. You have experimental data, which is deliberately created under controlled conditions. And then data that's either created in the lab or the field, where the lab is actually an artificial environment designed for scientific purposes, but the field is actually a naturally occurring environment. So how do we know what we know? Well, we have to think about this in terms of the counterfactual. The counterfactual is simply what would have happened had the intervention not taken place. Okay, and so the way that you can establish the impact is that you compare what did happen with what would have happened had the intervention not been there. Okay, so an example of this that we walked through is the community mobilization for education. I'll refer you back to the slides for this, but essentially we went through this example of what we're trying to accomplish and how we go about establishing impact. what the difference is between a needs assessment, a process evaluation, an impact evaluation, and a program evaluation. And then we talked about this summary right here, which is probably a pretty useful summary about what impact evaluation methods are available to us. And in terms of their power, what power means is their ability to establish causality from the design itself. Okay, so right at the top, you have experimental designs. And in the slides, we spent a lot of time talking about why experiments tend to be your best ways to establish causality. But even if you can't run an experiment, that still doesn't mean that you're not able to establish causality. You have these advanced quasi-experimental designs, basic quasi-experimental designs, and non-experimental designs. And I urge you to go back through and just understand what each of these. Okay. Then we talked about poverty and inequality, one of the most important aspects of development. For both poverty and income inequality, we talked about different ways to measure these things. So for example, here we see income inequality being measured using the coefficient of variation, Kuznets ratio, the Lorenz curve, the Gini coefficient. I would expect you to know what these are. Okay. We also talked about the relationship between growth and inequality, and this is an empirical relationship that was observed by Simon Kuznets, who found that there is an inverted U relationship between inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, and income, which is per capita GNI. Okay, that is, as countries start to grow, inequality at first increases and then decreases. Now, there's different explanations for this, but the one that I like, the one that's the most compelling to me, is that as countries start to grow, income concentrates amongst a few members of society. Over time, that money is used to improve institutions, and particularly institutions towards redistribution. And then those redistributive institutions allow for a reduction in inequality over time. Now, you can measure poverty both in terms of income and assets. So we're going to talk about how poverty is measured. And here's examples of what it means to be asset poor versus asset non-poor, and income poor versus income non-poor. Okay, and the key thing to remember is if you're asset non-poor, you have the ability to generate income from your assets rather than from your effort. Okay, so in that sense, your assets are able to generate income for you, and that allows you to protect against things like income shocks. Okay, so in that lecture, we talked about income inequality, concepts, measures, and consequences, poverty, also concept, measures, and implications. We also talked about the poverty trap, which I would expect you to know, and different anti-poverty measures that people have taken in the past. Then we talked about population growth, migration, and urbanization. One of the important things here was really about how we, migration is actually, and population is a deeply, deeply important feature that you may not necessarily have thought about all that deeply. Okay, and something that we sort of worry about, and we have models to account for this. Okay, but it starts with this decision to acquire children. Okay, so that's the first question that we have, is how do people decide, poor families in particular, but non-poor families as well, how do they decide how many children to have? And here's essentially an equation that we boil it down to, thinking about children as investment goods. Okay, so I'm not going to go over the equation now in detail, but the idea is that you have these probabilities of having a child grow up to take care of you, and the probability that you want, and so you solve n for for the optimal number of children. Okay, so you can think about children as risky investments. Okay, and that allows you to make a decision about how many children to have. Now, the other aspect of this was also migration, and essentially why people move from one place to another. Typically, here's a smattering of reasons to move. Job search tends to be the big one, but also lots and lots of other reasons as well. And that's what has led to sort of mass migration, particularly in this previous century, of moving away from rural areas and moving into urban settings. Now, it won't surprise you to know that people have modeled this. The most famous one comes from Harris and Todaro, which is essentially trying to understand why unemployment persists, even though the Lewis model makes a clear prediction that there will be no unemployment. Okay, and the idea is basically that people migrate based on probabilities. Yeah? So they decide to rationally migrate from agriculture to industry specifically based on the expected wage rather than the actual wage. Okay, so that's the key distinction between Harris, Todaro, and the Lewis model in the past, which leads to fairly different predictions coming out of the model. Okay, so the Harris-Todaro model is, in that sense, better because it makes predictions that are more in line with what we observe in the real world. Okay. Then we talked about agriculture and land. And one of the key aspects to this was this idea of sharecropping. Okay, so you have these graphs here, but the idea is that sharecropping is this risk-sharing contract that farmers engage in with landowners, okay, to try and smooth the risk that the farmer takes. Basically, it's sharing the risk with the landowner. Okay, and so how they do that is they say, all right, landowner, as a farmer, I'm going to till the soil, and whatever I produce, we split 50-50. Okay, now that tends to be an optimal contract from a risk-sharing perspective, but it has impacts on productivity, right? And what these graphs basically are, Fred Marshall demonstrated this, what they simply show is that because the marginal product of labor, so this is, the amount of product that my one unit of labor produces, is halved. I give away half to the landowner. Because it's halved, there should be an under provision of optimal labor. And so what that implies is that farmers will underprovide labor, making this generate less surplus. So sharecropping is widely seen as one major reason for lower productivity in developing countries. But that being said, of course, we can't forget that sharecropping is a risk-sharing contract, and in developing countries where uncertainty is pretty high, risk also tends to be high, and there's not a lot of formal institutions to protect you from that uncertainty. Sharecropping does actually become an optimal contract from the perspective of risk sharing. Okay. Now, of course, coping with risk is crucial, and it also identifies or impacts the way that farmers are likely to engage with technology. So if you have a farmer that's producing at or near their minimum consumption requirement, so these are what we would call subsistence farmers. They're growing just enough to eat, and that's it. Asking them to try out a new technology is virtually impossible, because if they have a bad crop, they die. and therefore the game for them ends. And so their tolerance of risk is very, very low. In fact, minimal. So they're much less likely to try a new fertilizer, even though that might increase their productivity and shift them away from subsistence farming. Now, of course, the farmers are operating maybe closer to their minimum desirable consumption level. So this is not just this is, I grow enough to feed me and then some, that I could sell some in the market, or store it away for worse times. Then I'm much more likely to adopt new technologies and thereby increase productivity. Okay. Then in lecture 7, we talked about labor, health, and human capital, right? And now we're going to talk about sort of productivity more seriously. But first, we'll talk a little bit about the health trap. So remember this S-curve. I think lots of you at different times try to replicate this in the course test to varying degrees of success. The important thing to remember with the S-curve is that it's got these 3 inflection points, right? It's got 2 sort of stable equilibria and 1 highly unstable equilibria. So the equilibrium at the bottom left is the stable one, but this is the health trap. Yeah, basically it's a vicious cycle of poor health today leading to poor health tomorrow, right? And so what you need as an intervention to get you well past the inflection point, almost all the way to the good health equilibrium, in order for you to sit at the good health equilibrium. So the amount of resources required to escape the health trap is massive. The amount of resources, the amount of a shock required to get you out of the good health equilibrium is very, very high. Very low. So just a low shock can nudge you or push you away from good health equilibrium into a bad health equilibrium. And in fact, some people are arguing that this coronavirus crisis is in fact exactly that, right? So it's exposing the vulnerabilities that we have, but also other societies have all over the world. Okay, so but the major point is it needs a tremendous amount of resources to get you out of the bad health equilibrium. And of course, the health trap creates other traps as well, creates nutrition traps, creates education traps for children, creates poverty traps as well. So I'd like you to know what each of these traps are and how they're interrelated. Now, the decision to acquire education. Okay. Now, this is sort of illustrated most neatly by this graph here. The idea here is that there's a decision that we make on whether or not to pursue education. Education incurs direct costs. So these are things like fees, uniforms, etc., books. And you have indirect costs like the amount of money that you give up in order to go to school. So if you're already working, you have to give up that source of income in order to stay in school. Now those direct and indirect costs put together must be lower than the expected benefits that you expect to accrue from pursuing that additional year of education. Okay, so as long as those costs are smaller than the benefits, you engage or you go ahead and pursue another additional year of education. If those are not, right, if your the benefits are smaller, then you wouldn't do it. We also talked about private versus social benefits and cost of education, and the idea here was, as a society, the government, or the government in general, needs to make a decision about how much education to provide to their population that's essentially paid for by them, right? So how much education we'd like our population to have. Now, in terms of private benefits, they're almost exponential. So it's almost always true that your expected private returns are going to be higher and well offset the costs, no matter how much education you pursue. There is, of course, some empirical evidence that we have that it peaks at master's, so PhD is not necessarily going to bring even additional higher private returns, but in any case, private returns tend to be higher the more education you get. That is not true for social returns. So we see high levels of impact upon getting primary education. It's important that all of us know how to read and write, but the costs, the social costs of providing secondary, tertiary, higher, colleges, universities, increase tremendously. Okay, and so the optimal level of education that a society needs to provide can be very different from the optimal level of education that we would like for us. Okay, and so these graphs essentially illustrate that point. But the key thing to remember is social benefits and costs can vary substantially from private benefits and costs. Okay. Then we talked about trade and development. We're running through here. So in trade and development, there's a few things that I'd like you to remember. First is just why do we trade at all? And the classic argument in favor of trade is still the best one. The idea of comparative advantage, that we will both do better if we specialize in the type of goods that we have comparative advantages in and then trade. Okay, so we talked about that, right? But there's critiques. Now, what the comparative argument, advantage argument, essentially implies is that we should have no trade barriers. Okay, we should have completely free-flowing trade, also free-flowing labor, free-flowing physical capital, and so on. All right, but of course, it's challenging to implement this because comparative advantage assumes fixed physical resources, assumes full employment, and assumes that capital and labor is completely mobile across borders and so on. And we know that a lot of these assumptions are not true. And so there's been critiques of free trade, particularly by these North-South trade models, Michael Porter's competitive advantage theory and the Wentworth surplus theory, and I'll refer you back to the slides. But there's also empirical critiques of free trade, most notably the Prebisch-Sanger hypothesis, but also other empirical evidence from East Asian countries and the like about how even trade protectionism has been useful for industrialization. And even if you implement zero tariffs across goods, that still doesn't guarantee free and fair trade because of things like domestic subsidies that you wouldn't be able to control. Okay, and so the key thing to remember here is that while we have simple theories about why trade is a good thing, it's a complex issue, and it's a complex issue because of those theoretical critiques, but also these empirical critiques. And I would need you to know what these are. Okay. Then we talked about institutions and development in lecture 9. So this was the penultimate lecture. And essentially here we're thinking about what the role of government or the role of the state should be in the economy. Should it be a facilitator of goods and services? Should it be a direct provider of goods and services? And the way that we thought about sort of simple concepts that people argue about, capitalism versus socialism and so on, really has to do with the role of the state, right? What the state should be doing, right? And now we know that there's a consensus that it's either one of these extremes is not a good thing. So the state needs to be a facilitator first and foremost, but also a direct provider when uh, in certain cases, particularly in cases of public goods. Okay. Now, what we talked about is the planning approach, so versus the market approach. All right. A planning approach was an extreme form of government regulation. A market approach is an extreme form of government deregulation. Okay, and so it's important to know what the differences between those two are. It's also important to know what the Washington Consensus was, why it espoused, sort of the free market approach, and what sort of effect that had on developing countries, but also on developed countries. It's also important to know what the typology of goods is. So what are public goods, what are private goods, what are club goods, what are common pool resource goods, and what type of agent is best placed to deliver these sorts of goods. Okay. And then we talked about the final lecture, which is about behavioral economics and development. And here there are three key things to remember, or these three major principles of behavioral economics for development. First was thinking fast versus thinking slow, that lots of times we think automatically. We aren't these sort of computational reasoning machines that a lot of our models assume us to be. So we have to be careful and develop policies keeping that in mind. We also tend to think socially. We're deeply social animals, and we look at other people's behavior, and that helps us shape and guide our own. And then finally, we think with mental models, right? The world is a very complex place, and so we can't carry around all the information of the world in our heads. So we create simple models of the world, and we act in accordance with these models. Okay? Now, development policymaking needs to take those features of the behavioral agent into account. And so what that means is that when you develop a policy, you need to define and diagnose the problem, design your policy instrument to adapt to that problem, implement that policy instrument, and evaluate it. Evaluate it using our impact evaluation methods and so on. And then based on that, adapt your policy, okay, which would entail redefining and re-diagnosis. So policymaking should actually be seen as a process, not we implemented a policy and then we just left it at that, right? It's a learning experience, and we need to continue learning. And the reason why we do that is because our theoretical models don't hold all aspects of behavior that are potentially possible, right? Our theoretical models don't actually capture all of those things. So policy needs to actually adapt to all those nuances of people's behavior. And the only realistic way that we can do this is by adapting, evaluating, learning from our policies, and re-implementing them. And then we talked about these discussion questions. Now, as I told you, for the exam, at least one of these questions is going to be on the exam. We talked about these in the seminar, and I'll refer you to think back to each of those discussions. We had really enriching discussions on each of these. And so when you go to answer a question like this, it's important to approach it from all different angles, right? So these are questions that don't have clear right answers. And so what you need to do is argue essentially both sides, okay? And so you have to keep those things in mind. Of course, it's not your opinions that we're looking for. It needs to be backed up with, the concepts that we learned throughout in development economics, and even beyond if you see fit to do your research. Okay, that was the revision lecture. We've got through it in about 50 minutes. That's really great. I'd like to thank you again for taking the module with me. It's been a lot of fun. I'm sorry that we're having to do this over video, but if you drop me a line, tell me whether this worked for you. That would be good, because I can continue to use this in future years as well. I think it might be a useful thing to have. If you have any questions or concerns, please email me. Let me know. I will be having office hours. I'll make an announcement about those. And remember, there's past papers available. You can feel free to attempt a question from the past papers. Send it to me. I can mark it in real time, and that could be a formative assessment. Or we can sit and talk about things as well if you like. My time's available. Just need you to email me, typically set up an appointment, or come to office hours, and I'll send you details on how you can connect with me during office hours on Blackboard. Anyway, thank you very much, and good luck with the online assessment. You'll do great. Okay, bye.